Fenella McGerty, thank you very much for speaking to us. Uh, the military balance, your report, your annual report is out. For this year, what are your main findings, specifically, I suppose, on Russia and Europe, which is the main focus of seemingly the world's defence capabilities?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having me. I'm the defence economist at the Institute, so primarily focused on funding changes and what countries are doing in order to fund defence. And obviously, what's happening in Europe um, has been key over the last year. It was a really remarkable growth year in European defence spending. We saw 11.7% real terms growth in spending in Europe, and that is really remarkable for Europe. We've not seen that level of growth for decades. And it's a real indication of the threat level that countries are facing, because bear in mind, these decisions were made before Trump was elected. So countries were already um, bolstering defense and making quite difficult choices in order to reallocate funding towards defense. The level of growth that we saw in Russia does outpace that of Europe, understandably so. We saw a near 42% real increase in Russia's defence budget last year. 2025 growth in Europe looks to be a bit more subdued, closer to 15%. Still quite high, really, for a defence budget, but I think is an indication of Russia now moving to maintain spending at these much higher levels that have been reached over the last 3 years since the invasion of Ukraine. And Europe is responding, really trying to bolster defence, trying to recapitalise, finding different ways of funding defence as well, which is a really interesting trend that's coming through.
That's really interesting because I think there's a narrative in terms of Donald Trump has come in and now everyone wants to spend more on defence. We've had announcements this week from obviously the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, but also in Germany, the new Chancellor is suggesting he wants to boost defence spending. But actually, this trend is predating Donald Trump.
It had really kicked off in Europe in 2022. We have these pivotal points in European defence spending. The first was in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and we saw an uptick primarily in Eastern Europe, and then gradually Western Europe began to implement increases as well as the fiscal space opened up and it was possible. And the realization came through that capability gaps had emerged, that we really needed to invest in defence in Europe. And then the second pivotal point would be 2022 with the full scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine. And the level of growth that we've seen in the last 2 years is really a marked change from the previous decade. And it's driven countries to get towards that 2% of GDP goal that was in place for 2024 that was agreed a decade ago. And several countries have moved towards that. Several have gone well past. And again, you obviously have others that are nowhere near the benchmark, arguing that contributions to NATO come in other forms, either through contributions to operations or deployments or through military aid to Ukraine and things like that. So we're basically seeing now in 2025, when the increases are coming through, we've already reached a higher level of spending. So in Europe, it was potentially moving to more of a sustainment level of growth to keep spending at that level. But what we now have with the messaging from Donald Trump and the moves and the increasingly kind of unstable commitment from the US, say, into European security and defence, is that we might now have Europe looking to further increase defence. And that is really starting to bite, because even over the last 2 years, we saw these new funding instruments. We saw reclassification of expenditure to bolster sort of the top line for defence. So what we're now moving to is kind of a true level of increase for defence, and it's really starting to bite. So what we saw in the UK with this week's announcement of the defence budget increase came at the kind of cost of a US aid budget and or foreign aid budget, and that is really one of the decisions I think that governments are going to have to kind of increasingly make. It's the choices because things are so tight fiscally. And I think it's been interesting as well, the messaging in Europe, that something has to give. So is it pensions? Is it social spending? Is it something else? Or is it an easing of debt break rules, for instance, in Germany? So it's a real reorientation and a real rethinking of how to fund defence.
And what does give in countries where they spend more, for example, in Estonia or Poland? In your report, as you say, it's that in raw terms is not as much as the big spenders in NATO, be it France and Germany and the UK, but as a proportion of GDP, they're spending much more on defence. What does give in those sorts of countries?
So generally, as a kind of proportion of GDP, we do see healthcare and education and social spending lower in other countries compared to Western Europe. The pensions costs in countries like France and Germany and the UK are higher. In the UK, certainly healthcare is a far higher proportion of government spending than in other countries, naturally because of the NHS. And it's that difference, that orientation, and of how public spending is distributed. And because of the perceived threat level feeling that much more acute in Eastern Europe, that's why those decisions have been made. And we're seeing really remarkable funding instruments come through, really quite rapid defence industrial development as well, where countries are focusing on niche capabilities or areas of quite urgent requirements that have emerged. And it is remarkable the pace that has happened so far, but there is still the messaging across Europe that more needs to be done, that funding needs to be maintained, bolstered, further committed to, and that increases for defence are on capability, on R&D, on innovation, rather than on other aspects of the budget or lost through administrative processes and red tape. So really trying to cut inefficiencies and making sure that any funding increases are well spent and not lost in a muddled procurement system, shall we say.
So what are these? Starmer this week, for example, increasing defence spending, but also, as we've spoken about, Germany and other countries in a more sustained way over the last year. What are they trying to put money into now in terms of we spoke on this podcast earlier in the week to a former British Army officer who says basically the British Army has lost mass since the Cold War, and the war in Ukraine has shown actually you do need mass. You can't just be high tech and have good equipment. You do need numbers and boots on the ground. How much of this new defence spending is focused on trying to scale up European armies, or how much of it is R&D and modernisation, as you say?
So the increases that were enacted over the last 10 years, more so in the last three, were really focused on recapitalisation. It was on building stockpiles and resilience and making sure that munitions were, or the scale of production of munitions was increased. So a lot of initiatives were geared towards that. And also replacing any material donated to Ukraine. And where we saw the increases was in that investment account within the defence budget. So the funding on procurement, on acquisition, on capabilities. And the flip side is that the R&D investment, while not being cut or anything, was a fairly stagnant as a proportion. So I think countries now are looking to how they can help foster defence R&D and innovation in their country, and that messaging comes through if you look at how countries are trying to encourage the private sector to engage with defence and argue that defence is a public good, that isn't completely contradictory to ESG goals in funding investments and things in portfolios, that it's not akin to tobacco or other sectors that don't align with potentially ESG goals. And the messaging is that defense is ensuring security and stability and economic prosperity, that it's all feeding into that message, because ultimately you cannot achieve other goals unless your country is secure and stable. So that messaging that's coming through is that to try and encourage private investment in defense as well. And where while the levels of money are a lot lower in that sector compared to the ginormous sums that we have at the public level, it's because of funding R&D and innovation that's really the level of spending that we're talking about, which is a much, much lower level at the public level, if that makes sense. So because they're targeting R&D and innovation, the private sector is well set up to foster that. So where we also didn't see an awful lot of investment was in because of that focus on recapitalisation, the personnel spending within defence budgets, that share also stagnated. And that's why we've started to see things like readiness issues emerge across Europe. And I think the other point is just that over the last 10 years, it was a real focus on efficiencies and keeping production lines within within a sort of profitable level. There wasn't the focus on stockpiling, on resilience. That would have been seen as kind of an unnecessary move in defence industry. It was all about keeping things efficient, and the the moves since then have been to try and improve that, to bolster the levels of stockpiling that we have across Europe. And in that sense, that investment in industry is happening. There's trying to look at other ways to encourage joint production and cooperation across countries as another way to ease that funding pressure as well.
And how much do you think that more money and the way it is spent is a way that you can scale up personnel problems in European armies? Or is it actually a societal, cultural problem of people coming forward to want to join the armed forces? They've been shrinking since the Cold War. Is the answer governments throwing more money at it?
The primary, well, so across Europe, it obviously varies by country in terms of the mentality, I suspect, of the electorate and how acute the threat feels as to how engaged the populace are with national defence. And I think in the Nordics, we see very strong messaging, there's engagement, there's things like national service, and that seems to come through more than in countries, say, like the UK or even France, that there's perhaps less of a sense of urgency to really make those moves. So when there was the hint of national service a few years ago, there was obviously uproar across the UK because I don't think the country was potentially in that mindset then. But I think things have potentially shifted, and because of the level of deterioration, we're seeing a lot more focus on things like defence spending across media and everywhere. So it's I think feeding through to other sectors as well, and it's not just in our kind of little world anymore. It's really spread, and you can see it affecting other sectors and feeding through.
And in your report, you pick out that Russia is able to spend more on its defence than Europe because it has essentially been turned into a war economy by Vladimir Putin. Just talk us through what does that process actually look like? What does the Russian economy look like to focus all its efforts on its military?
So on the Russian spending point, the figure that is much higher in Russia is when you consider the fact that Russia has much lower domestic costs and um, produces most of its defense material domestically as well. So that's why it's appropriate to look at Russian defense spending in purchasing power parity terms, because it really illustrates the effective spending potential of the Russian defense budget. Because when you look at it in US dollar terms at market exchange rates, it looks like really quite a small budget for what they're able to fund, continue to develop the capabilities that they have, sort of mass spectrum. So it's the reason that we look at Russian spending in PPP terms is because of that, because they are so domestically sort of independent. Whereas in Europe, because of the prevalence of US defense material, now South Korea, it's it's the countries aren't as self-sufficient in their defense capabilities. There are imports. So we look at European spending in USD terms, and that's appropriate. So the comparison between Russian spending and European spending is a difficult one, but it's really to illustrate that in PPP terms, Russian spending is effectively at the same level as Europe's because their domestic costs are so much lower. In USD terms, yes, European spending is still higher. But the main point is that by looking at it this way, that's why Russia seems to be able to fund so much more. And there are other aspects. So beyond that, it's the other spending that we can't quantify in Russia. It's the costs that have been borne by local governments, by the defense industry itself, and by the families of war personnel. So it's these wider costs that we can't quantify as well. So our estimate is actually probably not capturing all of Russian defense expenditure because you cannot, because of this how oriented production and the economy has been. The reforms have been remarkable in Russia in order to make these shifts in production to ramp up the levels and the scale. And it's really that orientation that we've seen across Russian defense industry that's meant that it has been able to sustain this level of funding, this level of warfighting intensity for the last 3 years.
So it sounds like, in terms of Europe trying to counter Russia, if Europe is going to
Mm.
have to be the main peacekeeping force in Ukraine going forward, there's a real challenge for Europe in terms of trying to overcome higher costs just to sort of get to the
Mm.
same level as the Russians.
Yeah, absolutely. The One of the things that we've been looking at in the institute over the last few years is things like supply chain resilience and the higher input costs that Europe is facing, because actually all these countries began increasing their spending all at once. Quite often the capabilities required overlapped, so there was this increased competition for the same goods, which obviously drives up prices. And there was also the sort of underlying issue of higher energy costs and things like that. So we just had this real pressure on defence spending through higher input costs, but also just general inflation. And that just made a lot of equipment plans largely unaffordable because the forward cost estimates didn't factor in these kinds of shifts. So, where we now have the case that further increases are needed, it's actually quite often to fund programs that are already in place. It's not for new capabilities or new programs, it's for making sure that we are actually able to afford the programs that are currently planned.
And for Europe, then, the level of coordination seems to be a bit of a problem. If everyone is ramping up defence spending and therefore competing for the same resources, the same manufacturers, how could Europe how could Europe improve its coordination to try and lower the cost for itself?
I think the initiatives at the EU level have been really targeted and maybe more ambitious even over the last 3 years to try and encourage collaboration and cooperation in Europe, to try and make sure that increased funding on defence in Europe goes to European defence companies as opposed to imports that can be potentially produced at a faster scale or anything like that. So trying to encourage domestic or at least regional production and investment. So we're seeing funding instruments, but also moves to bring countries together and ensure that there are possibilities for further collaboration, and that the EU is going to fund these kinds of programs as well and encourage member states to work together. We have also looked at the sort of issue between that has emerged that with third-party access. So because the UK is no longer in the EU, access to these funding instruments gets complicated because of restrictions on third-party access that can make it quite untenable for that engagement. So those kinds of things might need a rethink because everything has changed. The strategic environment has changed, and it would therefore potentially require even stronger measures, even more ambitious measures to encourage cooperation, to make sure that spending is allocated effectively, because there are so many demands on public finances that wasteful spending in defence is just getting it's just unacceptable as we increase the funds for it. So we need greater transparency, we need greater accountability, and a view of where spending will be, so the industry can plan. Long-term planning for defence is has its own issues, but is certainly better than having no long-term plans, so the industry can't invest with confidence.
And a couple more questions, and then I will let you go. The How quickly does this spending come into effect when we consider the fact that Russia and Ukraine, to be fair, have essentially had a 3 year head start on the rest of Europe, at least a 3 year head start? How quickly can Europe try to ramp up and hit the sorts of levels it might need to be peacekeepers in Ukraine, and how much does it rely on, say, the Ukrainian forces being ahead of the curve, as it were?
I think the pace with which increases can be made, it does need to be a careful one in terms of ramping up spending. I think all this focus on getting to a certain level, or making those choices and doing it by a certain year, and making sure that there's this the sense of urgency is required and needed. But if it happens too quickly, it does risk funding either going on the wrong programs, or quick decisions that don't actually fund the capabilities that are needed in the short term, or even longer term. So the balance is a tricky one to strike. And obviously, Russia and Ukraine, the pace had to be so much faster. And it's been remarkable what Ukraine has developed while at war. The level of investment that has happened, and the decisions that have been made in order to bolster sort of defence industry. And I think if Europe is able to engage more, and we are seeing companies look to collaborate with the Ukrainian defence industry, or cooperate with them as well, to maybe try and benefit from the lessons that Ukraine have learned, and the pace of development that has happened there. I think it's been a potential issue across European defence development is the pace over the last few years. So it's a balancing act between making sure that the funding is there, but also making sure that it's spent effectively and on the right things.
And of course, the one country we haven't spoken about in great depth so far is the United States. Donald Trump wants to shift the US focus away from Europe, hence this surge in European leaders trying to spend more on their defence. Where is US defence now going to be spending, do you think, going to be focused under Trump, maybe beyond Donald Trump, if that's his legacy going forward, that he reorients the US's defence focus?
Absolutely. It's been a very interesting few weeks in terms of announcements about what is going to happen to the US defense budget. If anything, there is less certainty about what's going to happen to US spending than in Europe, which is remarkable. The US has always been it's always been quite a clear defense budget. There's always been a future years defense program that gives you a sort of five year outlook as to what's going to happen to the US defence budget. It's not always stuck to, but it's at least a indication of where funding levels are going to go. And the announcements that we've had over the last few weeks in terms of reducing personnel, cutting the probationary workforce, finding 8% of savings in the FY26 budget, and then reorienting those program cuts towards the priorities of the Trump administration. So losing any programs that might focus on climate change mitigation, or any other programs that aren't within the priorities, as I say, of the Trump administration. So looking then to shift it towards things like the American Iron Dome, or sort of missile defense and everything. So it's really a remarkable reorientation. Whenever we have a new administration come in, there is some shift in the defence budget and a reprioritisation, but the level of change and the impact does seem to be more extensive than in previous years, in previous administrations. The lasting impact comes through when you consider how difficult it is to maintain skilled personnel. So if these personnel shifts are made, if programs are cut, you lose that personnel, you lose that knowledge, and replacing that takes so much longer than maintaining it. So I think the lasting impact is really there, because a new administration could come in, they could reinstate these programs, but it's starting from sort of scratch, or from a point that was potentially even further behind in the current year, if that makes sense. So that's the sort of issue that comes through. And then at the top line, so the reorientation is likely to look towards more domestic programs within the US DoD budget. And then at the top line, you have to consider sort of military aid or spending on Ukraine, Israel, Indo-Pacific. So that was a huge jump in the US's FY24 budget. So going forward, any decisions on international aid, on engagement in different regional theatres, funding for Indo-PACOM or EUCOM, like the different regional programs that the US funds, those decisions will have an impact in terms of how much security, how much investment in the security of each of these regions the US is going to make, and that will impact the US's defence budget top line. So it's such an ambiguous question at the moment, and that's why we're seeing it kind of reflected in the share prices. If you compare European stocks, we had companies like Saab see a huge jump in their share price over the last few weeks, and then conversely, when you look at the US primes aren't faring as well potentially. I mean, it's a moving, it's sort of a daily shift, but largely because of the uncertainty and the messaging that's coming through, the jump hasn't been we're seeing it reflected in US share prices as a bit more ambiguous.
Fenella McGerty from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Tom.